The richest, most powerful nation in history began as a geopolitical afterthought. When European conquerors first stumbled onto the Americas, they looked at the massive northern continent and largely ignored it for over 100 years. Spain and Portugal had drawn a line down the map to divide the non-Christian world between them. They spent the 16th century building massive empires in Central and South America, where the climate was familiar and the ground was packed with gold and silver. The Spanish did send an expedition into North America in 1539, but they found no precious metals. They wrote the entire region off as useless territory and focused their resources on the wealth further south. Because the dominant global powers of the era looked away, the North American coastline was left wide open. This created a massive, unpoliced vacuum that allowed an entirely different kind of empire to take root, far from the eyes of the European superpowers. England eventually established its own colonies along that east coast. A century and a half later, the British successfully drove the French out of the continent, but that victory drained their treasury. To recoup the costs, London began aggressively taxing the American colonists. The colonists argued that they could not be taxed by a parliament where they had no formal representation. This disagreement escalated from local protests into a full-scale armed rebellion, and eventually a formal declaration of independence. Winning the war did little to stabilize the young nation. By 1789, the first American government was failing. The 13 states functioned like independent, squabbling countries, and hostile European empires loomed on every border. The United States was a fragile, financially ruined confederation, fighting simply to remain intact. The primary engine of early American expansion was demographic. The average family had 7 children, and the population effectively doubled every 20 years. This explosive growth meant the original colonies ran out of room, pushing settlers westward into unclaimed territory. The first major break came from France. Napoleon Bonaparte wanted an American empire, but he needed fast cash to fund his wars in Europe. For $15 million, the United States bought the Louisiana Territory, doubling America's physical size. This secured the Mississippi River, a vital shipping artery connecting interior farmers to the port of New Orleans. The government followed this with aggressive land acquisitions. When American settlers in the sparsely populated Mexican territory of Texas rebelled and formed an independent republic, the U.S. annexed it. That border dispute triggered a war with Mexico, ending with America claiming the entire Southwest. This time-lapse map highlights how quickly the border shifted. Through a mix of lucky timing, cash purchases, and military force, the United States stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific in barely 50 years. But this rapid expansion exposed a deep fracture within the country. As new territories were added, arguments boiled over regarding whether the brutal economic system of slavery would be permitted in the newly acquired Western lands. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Southern slave states stated he would abolish the practice and seceded from the Union. This plunged the expanding nation into a devastating civil war. The North's victory preserved the Union and abolished slavery, but the nation had effectively exhausted the continent's available land. To keep growing, America began looking across the oceans. With the western frontier officially closed, the United States pivoted its strategy. It shifted its focus from acquiring contiguous farmland to securing strategic global outposts to support a modernized, ocean-faring navy. They began by claiming isolated islands in the Pacific via the Guano Islands Act. Then, when the Russian Tsar found his empire short on funds, American diplomats secured the purchase of Alaska for just over $7 million. American businessmen took control of the Hawaiian Islands. While Washington initially hesitated to annex the territory, officials feared that if the United States didn't act, a rival like Germany or Japan would use the islands as a base to attack America in a future war. These acquisitions sparked a fierce domestic debate. Many argued that America should remain an isolated republic, while others believed the nation had to embrace the role of an interventionist empire to protect its own interests. Ultimately, America chose the path of empire. The government prioritized strategic global positioning over its own founding anti-colonial ideals, setting the stage for a new role on the world stage. That new policy was tested in Cuba, where revolutionaries were fighting for independence from Spain. After an American warship sank in a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor, the U.S. issued an ultimatum for Spain to leave, leading to a declaration of war. The conflict was over quickly. American forces dismantled what remained of the Spanish Empire, forcefully expelling Spain from the hemisphere and taking control of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Theodore Roosevelt soon stepped into the presidency, viewing these new territories as bases for a massive, modernized naval fleet. He used this Great White Fleet to project American power and influence global politics with a new level of aggression. To tie this global network together, the U.S. supported a revolution in Panama to secure the right to build a massive canal. Finished in 1914, it physically connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, giving the U.S. Navy unprecedented mobility between the two hemispheres. In just 400 years, the United States transformed from an ignored stretch of wilderness into a bi-coastal global empire. By the time the First World War began, the nation was perfectly positioned to dominate the coming century.